The graphics card, a central component in any modern gaming PC. These cards accelerate everything from high-speed games to video playback to the operating system itself. Nearly everything relies in some form on discrete graphics processing, but it wasn't always that way. Rewind with me back to the 90s, a time when PC gaming was on the rise, when the sudden emergence of dedicated 3D graphics cards changed everything. You know the names: ATI, Matrox, S3, Videologic, Nvidia, and of course, 3DFX. This was arguably the most important period in the history of PC gaming. On this episode of DF Retro, brought to you by Digital Foundry and Nvidia, we're stepping back into the early days of 3D cards. For those that experienced this time period, this promises to be a journey down memory lane, but for those that didn't, hopefully you'll gain a new appreciation for the rapid and explosive changes that occurred in the PC gaming space during this era. So, grab your favorite GPU and let's get started. The early 90s. Console gaming was huge. Nintendo and Sega were household names. New consoles were on the horizon. Personal computers had a niche carved out, but standards weren't fully established. In time, however, the IBM PC compatible started to emerge as the standard of choice for gaming. CD-ROM demonstrated new multimedia frontiers. Advanced sound cards produced immersive soundscapes, and the arrival of games such as Doom demonstrated the 3D prowess made possible by Intel's 486 microprocessors. During the first half of the 90s, these elements would combine, allowing for more advanced, demanding games to be created. But even with the fastest machines in the market, performance was often an issue. Now, these days, PC gaming is all about hitting those high frame rates, 60, 120, 144, and higher even, but that really wasn't the case back then. Games demanded a lot from PC hardware of the era, and this, combined with the rapidly evolving market, meant that most users weren't exactly enjoying high performance. Enter the dream of 3D acceleration. It started slowly enough, cards mostly targeting the professional workstation market for CAD and 3D rendering. These emerged, but others would start to focus on gaming. I remember reading about 3D cards in an early issue of Computer Gaming World. My interest and the interest of others was piqued. But early cards were expensive and not well supported by games, while the APIs just weren't there yet. Of course, we all know the story by now. 3DFX kicked down the door and entered the market with its competitively priced Voodoo graphics. The Glide API ended up defining the generation while pushing Microsoft's Direct 3D and even OpenGL to evolve. But what gets lost in this tale is both how much of a leap this truly represented, and just how broad the competition was. To fully understand that, let's first consider what PC gamers without a dedicated 3D graphics card were dealing with, starting with Quake. Its release was a big deal to say the least. When Quake launched on the PC, it was a DOS game that ran exclusively in software mode. Now, a Pentium-based PC could deliver a relatively smooth frame rate at a lower resolution, such as 320 by 200. Now, I'm testing this on a Pentium 3 500 MHz, which is well beyond what was available at the time. And yeah, at this resolution, it runs beautifully. But even on this machine, if you pump it up to 640 by 480, the performance begins to falter. The frame rate drops into the teens and low 20s at best, and while it does look nice, it really isn't smooth or playable at all. To enjoy Quake at a solid frame rate, you needed to sacrifice visual quality and resolution. Now, how about another game then? Tomb Raider. This revolutionary title ushered in a new era of fully 3D action adventure games, and while it was hugely popular on PlayStation, of course, the PC version was equally important, I would argue. By default, it runs at a low 320 by 200 resolution with visuals similar to the PlayStation version, which honestly was perfectly adequate at the time, but there was another option, the option to run at a full 640 by 480. I think you're getting the picture here. By 96, PC gamers wanted that resolution boost, and games were happy to provide it, but as you can see, in software mode, it just wasn't smooth. This is where 3D acceleration starts to come into play. And yes, there were other 3D cards that appeared first, but it was the release of the 3DFX Voodoo graphics cards, released in late '96, that really changed everything. Let's go back to Quake, actually. The first accelerated version of Quake was V-Quake, which ran on the Rendition Verite V1000, but unfortunately I was not able to get my hands on one of these for this video. I've been searching a long time, and they're very difficult to find. But from what I can tell, it was visually impressive, and in fact Richard Ledbetter actually had one of these cards back in the day. Now, not long after this, John Carmack unleashed GL Quake, which 3DFX was very quick to support with its mini GL driver designed to accelerate just the OpenGL features required to play Quake. It was a watershed moment in PC gaming. GL Quake massively improved the rendering quality of the game by adding things such as texture filtering, mip mapping, high resolution support, higher color depth, and most importantly, faster performance. Oh, and later, you could even add transparent water, which was kind of the cherry on top. Now, software Quake was very slow at 640 by 480, but a Voodoo card could deliver higher frame rates with improved visuals. I believe Quake is the game that single-handedly rocketed 3DFX to the top of every PC gamer's wish list, and served as a strong starting point for the card. Now, these were early days for OpenGL. This new API was developed as an open alternative to SGI's proprietary Iris GL, and John Carmack backed OpenGL over Direct3D. Now, D3D and DirectX in general was also in its early days and was more widely supported, but Carmack preferred the ease of use of OpenGL and its performance, I suppose, which, considering the popularity of Quake, was a strong statement indeed. Now, this meant that fewer cards could actually support GL Quake when it hit the market, and Carmack alluded to this in one of his plan files. A lot of PCs came bundled with graphics cards at this time, while the lower price drew people in, but if you were using, say, an ATI 3D Rage Pro, an S3 Verge, a Matrox Mystique or Millennium 2, or any number of other cards, you weren't playing GL Quake. It just didn't work. Now, you could technically start it, but it would render in software mode at a very low frame rate, trying to simulate what a 3D card does entirely on the CPU. There were other cards, though, from this area that could support GL Quake. 3D Labs was there early on with its Permedia-based cards, which supported OpenGL and GL Quake, but it was very slow. But their Permedia 2 board, which launched 1 year after Voodoo Graphics, managed to offer competitive performance, despite the typically professional focus of 3D Labs products. Now, Permedia 2 really does work pretty well in GL Quake, but I found it to be somewhat slower than a Voodoo card, despite being released later. Now, for this footage, I am admittedly showing Voodoo 2 footage, and this is because the motherboard on my retro PC died at the end of the third day of capture, so I didn't get a chance to actually showcase this game running on Voodoo 1. Just imagine it looking exactly the same, but running at a frame rate more comparable to the Permedia. NVIDIA also released its first big card after the experimental quad-based NV1. The Revo 128 was designed as a 2D and 3D solution in one card. It supports GL Quake, but it does appear rather dark, while still falling short of both Voodoo and Permedia 2 performance, but it was a very promising start. Still, this was an important release, and while 3DFX came out on top with GL Quake, this is a game that helped drive the market forward, a game that demonstrated the strengths of 3D graphics cards and also helped make OpenGL relevant in the gaming space. Now let's go back to Tomb Raider then. After launch, several patches were developed to allow the game to take advantage of 3D accelerator cards. Perhaps the most famous of these is the 3DFX Voodoo patch, which enables 640 by 480 resolution visuals with texture filtering, higher color depth, and other enhancements. But what's really cool about this version is that it not only brings this bilinear texture filtering and smoother performance to the table, but it also adds some sort of anti-aliasing to the mix that I haven't really seen in other games from this era. Note how smooth the lines on the character models are. Aliasing is all but eliminated. It looks really impressive. The thing is, at this point, it should already be clear that standards hadn't yet been fully embraced. I already discussed OpenGL and D3D earlier, but Tomb Raider is a DOS game, which supports neither. Each 3D patch needed to be written specifically for the target card, which of course wasn't a lot of fun for developers, I'd imagine. For Voodoo, that meant utilizing the proprietary API, Glide. That's right, Glide. Today we have Direct3D, Vulkan, OpenGL, and the like, but back then, 3dfx managed to gain a significant amount of developer support for its Voodoo graphics-specific API known as Glide. It enabled faster access to the hardware, allowing smoother performance all around, plus perfect compatibility. For several years, Glide was the API of choice for 3D games, in fact. It's difficult to imagine such a situation today, but it basically served as a guarantee to the consumer during a time of incomplete standards. If you bought a game that supported Glide and owned a 3dfx card, it would just work. Well, most of the time. This becomes most evident in 1998's seminal Unreal. If you purchased an original 3dfx card back at release, you could still enjoy this cutting-edge game exactly as it was intended to be played. Unreal is just one of many games that natively support the Glide API, and it shows. Unreal specifically takes full advantage of the 3dfx hardware with a lot of unique blending modes and special effects. Multi-layered skies, an impressive fluid system, and beautiful lighting all really stand out. Unreal offered some new effects that we hadn't really seen before as well. For instance, detailed textures. Basically, the developers used a noise layer when in close proximity to a texture surface to help lend that surface additional detail. It was very effective. Also, the glowing spheres of light used throughout the game, that was kind of new as well. Now, when Unreal first launched, it only supported software rendering 3dfx Glide for use with PowerVR PCX2 cards. I actually owned a PowerVR card at this time, but unfortunately I no longer have it, so I couldn't test this again. And like the rendition, it's very difficult to find. It is interesting though, as this is an example of another hardware-specific API in action. The SGL version of Unreal actually lacks some of the visual features of the 3dfx version, which I discovered after upgrading to a Voodoo 2. So unless you owned one of these two cards capable of supporting the proprietary APIs available in the game, you were stuck playing Unreal in software mode. Now, weirdly enough, this isn't such a bad thing, as Epic used MMX technology to deliver rather impressive results. They managed to even fudge a primitive form of texture filtering in the game. The problem is, transparency relies on stippled alpha, and the requirements were really high. Playing software Unreal at 640x480 just wasn't a smooth experience, even on a high-end machine of that time. Thankfully, Epic would eventually patch in Direct3D, OpenGL, and even support for the S3 Savage cards, but the implementation demonstrates just how messy the situation was. Simply put, if you had purchased one of many cards competing with 3dfx prior to Unreal, you were probably in for a bad time. So let's take a look at a few of these, starting with the ATI 3D Rage Pro in Direct3D mode. OpenGL does not work on this card, it should be mentioned again. Now, I tested several different drivers for this one, and I'm using the AGP variant of the card, but none of them performed correctly. I would describe this as broken, really. It runs slowly, but it looks awful. Some of these issues can be improved by disabling MIP maps, which don't function properly in this hardware for some reason, but it doesn't solve all the other problems such as flickering, flashing, and the strange colors. And none of the blending modes seem to work correctly either. It's just a disaster. Now, the NVIDIA Riva 128 fares slightly better overall. I tested both OpenGL and D3D, but both exhibit similar issues, with OpenGL running slightly better. Now, it's reasonably playable, but the colors are washed out and the game just doesn't look right in action. And again, I tested several different drivers here. This is just how it works on the Riva 128, at least in this version of Unreal. But it gets worse. The Matrox Millennium 2. This card was marketed as a high-end 2D accelerator card with basic 3D functionality, similar to the cheaper Mystique cards from Matrox. It's kind of the anti-Unreal, if you will, and yeah, you can see that it barely works. It's very, very slow, and the visuals are completely broken. The game just isn't playable on this card. The Permedia 2, however, fares a lot better with the visuals that somewhat resemble Unreal. Yes, it's still clearly broken and alpha blending doesn't work properly on many effects, but it does look okay. This one was surprising to me though, as it really suggests a competitive feature set here with the Voodoo. What's odd though is that this card was pitched around OpenGL, and in fact this exact card is the Diamond Fire GL, but Unreal's OpenGL mode is basically non-functional on it. So D3D or software mode it is. Now there's plenty of other cards out there, and some may fare better, others may fare worse, but this is what I have in hand at the moment. The point is that you really couldn't rely on D3D or OpenGL support at the time, as most cards, and indeed games, didn't fully implement the standards correctly, leading to broken visuals on a wide range of configurations. This is a ringing endorsement for 3DFX Glide, if I ever saw one. Alright, now how about Need for Speed 3 Hot Pursuit, another very popular game from this era. Naturally, it supports the 3DFX card, and it looks glorious. Beautiful, color-soaked environments and clean, perspective-correct, filtered textures, along with detailed vehicles and cool weather effects, really elevated the PC version of Need for Speed 3. Of course, the game also features a software renderer, just like most other titles of this era, and at 640x480, it's very slow on this Pentium 3 system. If you didn't have a 3D card, low resolutions were a must. Clearly though, this demonstrates just how much of a leap the 3DFX version truly was. The software mode exhibits severe color banding, texture warping, while lacking the various effects and smooth alpha transparency. There's really no contest here, the 3DFX version looks and runs much better. Unlike Unreal however, Need for Speed 3 does feature a competent Direct3D implementation that manages to work reasonably well on a wider range of graphics cards. The ATI Rage Pro, for instance, which has failed to work in just about any game we've looked at thus far, finally displays the game correctly. The frame rate is low, and some visual effects don't work, but it's pretty much there. The Riva 128 then actually fares pretty nicely here too, with smoother performance and visuals that more closely match the 3DFX version. There's some minor blending issues here and there with certain alpha effects, but overall, it works okay. The Riva 128 was no voodoo, but you can really see that they were onto something with this card, and future projects such as the TNT, TNT2 and beyond would benefit greatly from this one. Then there's the Permedia 2 again, which manages to display the game correctly with only minor visual glitches. Problem is, like the Rage Pro, performance is pretty slow, which isn't good for a racing game. That said, it still looks and runs better than the software render on the same PC, so it would at least be an upgrade there. Of course, if you owned a Matrox card from this era, things were not good with Need for Speed 3. Basically everything is corrupted and completely lacking any sort of texture mapping. I was only able to play this at the lowest resolution as well, which is why the frame rate is reasonably smooth, I suppose. It's just that the game doesn't really work properly. The Mystique and Millennium cards simply didn't adhere to the D3D standard in any way, and the lack of hardware features means that games like this could never function properly, and they don't. So it's another win for 3DFX in Glide. While you could still have a reasonably smooth experience with certain other cards, the 3DFX board was clearly the way to go. Are you seeing a theme here? So were there any good examples of Direct3D from this era? Well, yes, quite a few actually, and perhaps the best one is Acclaim's Forsaken. This Descent-style 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter made use of blended, dynamic colored lights everywhere, and is one of the most compatible D3D games around. But first, here's Forsaken in its software mode at 640x480, and yeah, it looks pretty good, but as you can see, performance again is a serious problem. 3DFX naturally does a great job with this game, delivering faster performance and properly smooth visuals. All blending modes are supported, and it looks excellent in motion. What's great though is that all the other cards also manage to work fairly well too. The old Rage Pro, for instance, actually delivers a smooth, high frame rate experience while managing to deliver all of the major visual features. It looks and plays surprisingly well on this card. And the same goes for the Riva 128, which runs even better while looking just right. The Permedia 2 then fares similarly well even though performance does take a hit compared to the others. And the biggest surprise here is that the old Matrox Millennium 2 manages to deliver a smooth, performing, attractive game. Yes, the lack of alpha blending is an obvious problem here, but the game works okay. Now, Forsaken would be used as a test of Direct3D capabilities going forward with many publications and websites at the time. They relied on this data and listed it under Forsaken mark. It's an example of Direct3D done right. So at this point, I feel like we have a reasonably clear picture of the situation. Now I could go on for hours about this, like I also tested games like Turok, which didn't really work well on any of these cards except for 3DFX. Or what about something like Final Reality from Remedy? This benchmark was used to demonstrate what 3D cards were capable of at the time, and you could use it to pit your card and system in general against other systems. It was a really cool tool and very useful during this era. It also sort of explained which features your card supported and gave you an idea of how the game rendered visually compared to what it should be. But really, with all this, there's just two major things to take away from this video. Firstly, the leap from software rendering to 3D acceleration was a true revolution that changed PC gaming forever, and now you've seen just how much of a leap that performance truly was. The massive boost in frame rates, resolution, and visual quality really helped the PC platform become a truly great place to play games. This is the beginning of PC gaming as we know it today. Secondly, it also demonstrates just how far we've come in terms of standardization. Modern APIs are much more refined, and any hardware you'll buy today will at least support the games properly. You don't have to worry about a modern game appearing completely broken any longer. Sure, there's some new advanced features that are only available on certain tiers of cards, but you won't have an experience like, well, this. And I believe it was 3DFX that really was instrumental in getting us here. The success of the Voodoo and the Glide API basically helped support the industry until Direct3D was mature enough to become viable. Now as we stand on the verge of new graphics cards arriving later this year, but not of the S3 variety, I assure you, I hope you've enjoyed this tour of classic PC hardware. Did you own any of the cards back in the day? What were your experiences like? Be sure to reach out on Twitter and let us know. But that's all from me for the moment, so until next time, stay retro.